First, I want to say what a pleasure it is to be back in Santa Fe. My first 4 or 5 years as a tutor, I would come every summer for summer classics. And even though they were short weeks, it was really formative on me to be here. Mr. Venkatesh and I worked our way summer by summer through almost all of Jane Austen's novels. And he is now a tutor hero for me. And then the Stickneys would have us over for dinner every summer. So Santa Fe, my sense of what the college is about and what a tutor is has been deeply formed by Santa Fe. So there's also a handout. I sent my father a copy of the lecture with the handout, and he said the handout is a bit much. And I think he's right, so feel free to totally ignore the handout. All right, on to hell. Questions about hell started to pester me when I first tutored sophomore seminar. Though I was raised as a Christian and had 2 graduate degrees in theology, the Jesus I encountered in our seminar readings was not my Jesus. Back then, my Jesus was like the guy at the party who brings enough pot to share with everyone, and then by the end of the evening, he's told you about a mystical experience he once had on a canoe trip. Did I mention I'm a Canadian? That might help. But when I read Matthew from start to finish for seminar, Jesus wouldn't shut up about divine judgment and hell. And then my students, like the all-star Johnnies that they were, kept bringing up the passages that most bothered me. Our inquiry tonight has 2 main questions. What is Jesus' hell, and how does he understand divine judgment? Matthew's gospel is our focus because it includes by far the most references to hell of any of the 4 gospels. The lecture is in 3 parts. In the first, we approach hell through Jesus' teaching, considering the 7 references he makes to Gehenna, the main Greek word for hell. In the second, we approach hell through his storytelling, his very short stories or parables. And then in the third, I'll make the case that, contrary to the highly influential majority view, Jesus' hell wasn't about the afterlife. One last introductory comment. My lecture this evening assumes that Jesus was Jewish. Since relatively soon after his death, there has been a long line of pasty white guys like me who have yammered on about Jesus, and many of them have presented him as a Christian, often suggesting he was of the blue-eyed, blonde-haired variety with a chiseled chin and a firm set of abs. This Jesus was the founder of a new religion called Christianity, intended to replace Judaism. I won't speculate on Jesus' abs, but the rest of this account is, in my opinion, misleading, and in some applications of it, harmfully so. Tonight I will approach Jesus as a devout Jew whose imagination and intellect were suffused by the Hebrew Scriptures, and who devoted himself to recalling his covenant people back to their intimate and demanding relationship with God. If anything I say tonight sounds like that blonde Jesus, then you've either misunderstood me or I've messed up. Part 1, Gehenna in Jesus' teaching. In his first speech, Jesus embeds his first 2 ways to hell within an argument about how to interpret the Jewish law. Before he gets down to particular laws, he says, and I'm quoting, "Unless your justice exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." We're going to come back to the kingdom of heaven, but for now, notice that Jesus is launching a debate about the nature of justice. The first 2 ways to hell he mentions are anger and lust. So I'm sure no one here has anything to worry about. With the first law, the prohibition against murder, he stretches it to include getting angry. He specifically refers to the kind of anger that leads to insulting other people. This focus indicates why he links murder and anger. Murder is the most extreme way to degrade another person, but insulting someone can be a lesser means of such degradation. So while murder and anger aren't siblings, they're at least members of the same extended family. And now our first mention of Gehenna. In Jewish law, those accused of murder were to be judged by a court. Anger receives a similar treatment. Jesus notes two forms that judgment can take, one human and one divine. The human judgment is a trial. Anger can get out of control and you can end up in jail. There's also divine judgment, the hell of fire. He doesn't expand on this at this point, but just drops the first H-bomb and moves on. So far, we know only that hell is a form of divine judgment connected with fire. Now, next, with the law against adultery, the prohibition against sex with another man's wife, Jesus stretches it to include lust. In Greek, Jesus uses a good old-fashioned purpose clause, like those we study in freshman language. His focus is the kind of looking that sets out with the purpose of objectifying another. This isn't any looking that involves a bit of erotic appreciation. How is sleeping with another man's wife, though, related to merely looking lustfully at her? To have sex with a married woman is to disregard her relationship with her husband, and we implicitly show a similar disregard when we look lustfully at someone in a relationship. So even if adultery and lustful looking aren't siblings, they're at least cousins. And lust too provokes talk of Gehenna with one of Jesus' most perplexing and disturbing images. I'm quoting, "And if your right eye causes you to stumble, pull it out and throw it away from you. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away from you. It's better to lose one part of your body so that the whole of your body doesn't go to hell." Well, where do we start with that? The right eye, the dominant eye in most people, is the body part most involved in lustful looking. And so too the right hand, the dominant hand in most people, will likely play a major role in adultery. With this self-mutilation image, Jesus describes one strategy to avoid adultery: hack off the body parts that are most involved. But Jesus isn't recommending this strategy. This is a gory bit of satire. Let's say we're dumb enough to try this out. So we poke out one of our eyes. We'll quickly discover we've still got another eye to go about its randy business. Let's stick to our plan, though, and poke out the other eye too, and we'll surely discover lust remains alive and well within us. Jesus is mocking any approach to the law which focuses exclusively on our actions. If justice means nothing more than not having sex with others' partners, then that can be achieved by making it physically impossible for us to do so. With a bit of cutting, problem solved. Let's return to our first two laws. Of all the Jewish laws he could have chosen, and by one traditional tally, there are 613 of them, Jesus starts with two of the 10 commandments. He starts by going right to the center of the Jewish law. And with his interpretation of them, he gradually includes more and more of our personhood. He extends murder to include the degrading feelings we have about others. He extends adultery to include our objectifying gaze. The law on Jesus' account turns out to interrogate not only how we act, narrowly defined, but also what we feel about others and how we look at them. Jesus isn't making this up. Moses, back in Deuteronomy, promised that God would circumcise the Israelites' hearts. After all, if the law only addresses actions, then it excludes what so often gives birth to those actions. Not only that, if the law only addresses actions, then the most insidious kinds of vice go unacknowledged. I'm sure we can well imagine a man who would never dare cheating on his wife, who is nonetheless a misogynist jerk. Jesus offers an alternative to this approach to the law. He connects the first two laws to the divine judgment of hell, and then with the third, fourth, and fifth laws, he mentions no punishment. And then with the sixth, he specifies a reward. Jesus is gradually laying out a decision between hell and whatever the alternative is. The alternative comes with the sixth law, the command to love your neighbor. Jesus disagrees with interpretations that imply this means you can hate your enemy. Instead, he stretches the category of neighbor to include one's enemy. Because we don't usually choose our neighbors, there may be an enemy or two among them. But how is enemy love even possible? In a repeated move, Jesus invites us to see the world as God apparently sees it. He says that God, and I'm quoting, makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. The enemy is placed in relation to God as the creator, and the natural world as mediator of the precious gifts of sun and rain. With this image, Jesus depicts our enemy as a fellow creature, dependent and interdependent, just like all of us fragile creatures. This does not negate that there may be very good reasons that your enemy is your enemy. Instead, it situates that hostility within a wider context. This refined, expanded view contrasts with the distorted, narrow views of angry, insulting, and lustful looking. In the heat of anger, what most irritates us about another comes to define them. And when we look lustfully, our gaze is confined to some particular feature of another as we exclude so much of who they are. These first two ways to hell involve narrow, distorted perceptions of the other. And the alternative, represented by enemy love, is a refined God's eye view. Water break. Jesus' alternative to an action-based approach to the law defines justice in terms of love. Such love certainly includes actions, but it is more than that. Love draws on and integrates the whole of our personhood. To love God or a human being well requires our acting, feeling, and thinking. Yet Jesus doesn't think we change by trying harder. Whenever Jesus brings up Gehenna, he contrasts a distorted perception of human beings with a God's eye view. By doing so, Jesus invites us to imaginatively inhabit a divine perspective. Jesus invites us to change by inviting us to an act of imagination, by opening ourselves to the possibility that there is more to see about others and ourselves than we tend to notice. This act of imagination depends on trusting that there is a perspective that is both entirely accurate and endlessly loving, and that we can open ourselves to glimpsing what the world looks like from that most capacious point of view. Perhaps another way to describe this act of imagination, then, is as an act of faith. I said earlier that with the first two laws, Jesus warns of the divine judgment of hell, and then it's only with the last law that he specifies a reward. The reward for enemy love isn't that you go to heaven. Jesus says it's to be declared a child of God. Just as biological children may resemble their parents' appearance, so God's children resemble God's character. In particular, when we love our enemy, we reflect the indiscriminate divine generosity evident in the great variety of human beings whom God gives the gift of life. Recall that Jesus introduced his commentary on these laws by saying that only if one's justice exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees will you enter into the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven is by far Jesus' favorite metaphor in Matthew. In it, God is compared to a king whose throne is in heaven. The kingdom of heaven describes how God's rule, already fully present in heaven, has begun to make itself present on earth too. The kingdom of heaven then isn't heaven. It's wherever and whenever earth reflects heaven's influence. Jesus says that in him the kingdom of heaven has come near. This depicts his life as one such meeting of heaven and earth. He also says some are already citizens of this kingdom, such as children, the poor in spirit, and those who risk their lives for justice. And some will find it very difficult to join, including the rich and the political and religious authorities. To accept Jesus' invitation to imaginatively inhabit the divine perspective is to regard human beings as God does and to act accordingly. To do so is to become citizens of the kingdom of heaven. The reward involved isn't that you get to fly away to heaven someday. It's that you participate in the union of heaven and earth, which is already underway. So far, Jesus has identified two ways to hell: angry, insulting, and lustful looking, neither of which are addressed by the approaches to the law he so roundly criticizes. There are two more ways to hell which Jesus directs at religious authorities, including the leaders of his own community, his 12 disciples, and those of other Jewish reform movements, including the scribes and the Pharisees. Let me underline that point. Jesus speaks about hell most often to those at the top of their respective God squads. For the sake of time, I'm going to focus on what he says to his disciples. Jesus warns them of merciless leading after they ask him how to become great. He doesn't dismiss their ambition for greatness. He redefines it to include particular actions and a way of seeing. The actions are to attend to those who seem decidedly ungreat, like children and other vulnerable people. Jesus underlines the gravity of doing so by warning his disciples that merciless leading is another way to hell, and one that is especially possible for them. Yet for Jesus, warning of hell is always a transitional step. He warns against hell and identifies a distorted view of others, to see the vulnerable as impediments, and then again he offers a God's eye view. This God's eye view consists in two images. First, Jesus says that the vulnerable each have an angel or messenger who, I'm quoting, continually sees the face of my Father in heaven. God is pictured as a king again, and the best position in a monarchy is in the court, because you get direct access to the king. The vulnerable, apparently, have direct, intimate access to God. And then, like the good theologian he is, Jesus mixes his metaphors. God is like a shepherd who, if a sheep gets lost, leaves all the rest to find the missing one. Not only does God give the weak VIP access, God also leaves behind those who are safe and sound to reach out to the struggling. While Jesus specifies a few great actions, the true path to greatness lies in another act of imagination that is also an act of faith. The second misuse of religious authority that leads to hell is self-protective self-love. Before Jesus sends his disciples to grow his community among their fellow Jews, he says, and I'm quoting, "You have received a free gift. Give a free gift." This is a pithy summary of Jesus' approach to religious authority. He's not opposed to leaders or hierarchy, as long as they are a means of mediating to all others what is first given to a few. He sends his 12 disciples out to their fellow Jews so that they can grow his community, and he empowers them, as Matthew has it, with the ability to exorcise demons and heal the sick, telling them to announce that the kingdom of heaven has come near. But Jesus worries his disciples may fail to take up this dangerous work out of a self-protective self-love. But he has a cunning strategy to address this. First, he says they shouldn't fear other human beings who can only destroy their body. They should fear God who can destroy body and soul in hell. But Jesus doesn't leave them with fear. Warning of hell is always a transitional step. He engages their self-protective self-love so that he can move them past it. He does so with another God's eye view. In this case, it addresses a distorted image the disciples may have of themselves. Jesus claims that God has every hair on their head numbered. The intimate, comprehensive knowledge God apparently has of them means that there is no reason to fear what any human being can do to them. This act of imagination reconfigures what it means to love oneself, as in the particular situation the disciples find themselves in. Self-protection is not the right approach to take to risk. By following Jesus' 7 mentions of Gehenna, we've identified 4 ways to hell: angry, insulting, lustful looking, merciless leading, and self-protective self-love. But why are these 4 vices deserving of hell? Later in Matthew, a Pharisee famously asks Jesus to identify the greatest commandment. He answers by quoting Deuteronomy, "The greatest commandment is to love God with your whole self." But he also quotes a second commandment from Leviticus, to love your neighbor as yourself. Many Jewish teachers before and after Jesus were asked to summarize the law, and most chose one or other of those commandments. Jesus, though, is entirely original in his choice of Jesus is entirely unoriginal in his choice of commandments. He is, though, entirely original in not choosing one or the other of them, but choosing a pair. So what's the logic of this pairing? Consider the love of God. What does loving God with your whole self involve? Does a complete opening of the self to God involve a turning from the world? The second commandment prevents such an interpretation, as it gives 2 more objects of our love, neighbor and self. It assumes a healthy self-love, a recognition of our own worth, which is used as the means of opening us up to our neighbor. Frequently, we tend to overestimate our own worth, in which case the work is to attune yourself to your neighbor's equal worth. Though the commandment also addresses us if we underestimate our own worth compared to our neighbor, in which case the work is to attune yourself to your own equal worth. With this pairing of commandments, then, the divine and human are not opposed, but intimately related. Jesus is not making this up. In debates about the law, he often takes us back to Genesis. Recall those shocking words there. God made human beings in the divine image. With Jesus' pair of commandments, the self is open to God as the creator of this lovely, if damaged, world, who is at work to repair it. And the self is also open to God as God is reflected in our neighbors and even ourselves. The members of this pair are necessary to mutually illuminate the full meaning of one another. But back to hell. Angry, insulting, and lustful looking were exhibits A and B in Jesus' opening debate with exclusively action-based approaches to the law. Such approaches claim to embody the justice of the law without acknowledging two damaging ways we have of degrading each other. Jesus baldly claims that obedience to those interpretations of the law won't keep their adherents from hell. Further, with merciless leading and self-protective self-love, those in religious authority use their roles to exalt themselves while ignoring or denigrating others. And they justify doing so for the sake of greatness or holiness. All four of our ways to hell, then, set Jesus' pair of commandments in competition or opposition to one another. Jesus' rhetoric gets most hellish when the love of God is used to justify or cover over entrenched failures to love one's neighbor as oneself. And for him, this is not just an academic debate. He believes that some contemporary teachers of the law and other religious authorities, including his very own disciples, are willfully refusing to acknowledge how they are contorting the gift of the law and abusing their leadership roles. Yet, Jesus' warning of hell is always a transitional moment. He keeps offering a choice between a distorted way of viewing human beings and a refined God's eye view, which is to say, between destruction in hell and participation in the kingdom of heaven. All right, part 2. Images of hell in Jesus' parables. We turn from Jesus' teaching to his storytelling, focusing on 2 of his parables. We start with the longest parables of Jesus' first set, the story of the wheat and weeds. A man plants his field full of wheat seeds, then soon discovers someone else has also sowed it full of weeds. He decides not to do anything until the harvest, when the wheat is gathered into his barn and the weeds thrown into a furnace. This, of course, is an image of hell. So who goes to hell? Jesus identifies the weeds as, and I'm quoting, all causes of stumbling and workers of lawlessness. We might be tempted to assume, and many have, that we know what Jesus means, but we'll let him define his terms. Lawlessness is not a catch-all term for human naughtiness. Jesus only uses lawless to refer to other teachers and prophets, including the scribes and the Pharisees. Jesus is more than a little cheeky here, if I may say so. Those who regard themselves as most lawful, he calls the lawless. The second kind of weeds are causes of stumbling. Jesus only uses this phrase to describe the leaders of his community, first when warning them against merciless leading, and second when criticizing Peter for his self-protective self-love. So these 2 kinds of weeds fit perfectly with our 4 ways to hell. Jesus' hell, it turns out, is a rather exclusive club. He reflects here the Hebrew prophetic tradition, which announces God's judgment against those at the top who contort the gift of law and abuse their religious position. Jesus identifies the wheat as children of the kingdom. Again, we might be tempted to assume we know what Jesus means, but we'll let him define this term too. Sometimes Jesus uses kingdom and God interchangeably. So children of the kingdom recalls when Jesus called peacemakers children of God, and enemy lovers children of your Father. Just as biological children may resemble their parents' appearance, so peacemakers and enemy lovers resemble God's character. In his first speech, Jesus identified enemy love as the most godlike form of neighbor love. To love one's enemy requires you to set aside all the usual ways we divide each other up. Notice then that the wheat are a direct contrast to the weeds. The weeds represent the corruption of Jesus' tradition, while the wheat represents the highest embodiment of it. This contrast reflects one aspect of divine judgment. God distinguishes between a distorted form of human goodness and the real thing. At the harvest, the weeds end up in the furnace of fire where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Jesus uses this dental-centric image 6 times in Matthew. In 4 of them, though, there's no mention of flames. So the weeping and gnashing of teeth can't be only a response to fire. In 3 of those 4, hell is presented by a strikingly fire-free image, an outer darkness. We'll consider only one example, a wedding guest who is kicked out because he didn't dress up. I certainly feel sorry for him. As my partner Tom can tell you, I resent any occasion that requires ironing, even though, as Tom will also tell you, he does all of my ironing. Yet, as sartorially lazy as I am, I know that dressing up for a wedding contributes to the celebratory vibe. Our wedding guest then goes to the party, but he isn't really at the party. He has decided to exclude himself from full participation. The outer darkness isn't a new state of affairs for him. It's one of his own making. In all 3 of the outer darkness parables, the characters who get thrown out do so because they have persistently and willfully refused to open themselves in love to God or their neighbor. Yet these same characters have a confidence that they are in the right and will end up rewarded. Their weeping and gnashing of teeth, then, isn't a response to physical pain. It's an expression of anger, disappointment, and resentment when divine judgment discloses the stark reality they have made for themselves. This also applies to the weeds. Both kinds of weeds are convinced of their own holiness or greatness, and are thus horrified when they discover God disagrees. This reflects a second aspect of divine judgment. God discloses the anti-social character of the distorted form of goodness. At the harvest, the wheat is gathered into a barn. Jesus interprets this as a future time when, I'm quoting, "the just will shine out like the sun in the kingdom of their Father." Recall that Jesus identified the wheat as peacemakers and enemy lovers. So often these virtues can seem foolish or dangerous. Yet Jesus says the divine judgment will disclose the true character of these most social virtues. Shining out like the sun is an image of maximum publicity, an open vindication of these risky and much maligned ways of life. And they will shine in the kingdom of their Father. Thus, that publicity includes a clear declaration that by their peacemaking and enemy loving, they were participating in the union of heaven and earth. But as for those weeds, they get burnt up in a furnace. Fire is the most frequent image Jesus uses of hell. In addition to weeds ending up in a furnace, he talks of trees that produce rotten fruit getting thrown into the flames. These images work on a practical level. It is a long-standing practice to deal with unwanted plants by burning them. And all 4 of our ways to hell resemble invasive weeds or fruit trees with rotten fruit. These images underline how these plants threaten healthy growth. Recall that Jesus is at his most rhetorically fiery when he is castigating religious authorities for interfering with others' spiritual growth. The continued expansion of the weeds threatens the wheat. We come to another disturbing aspect of divine judgment. God acts to stop the spread of what persistently threatens healthy growth. Our final parable is also Jesus' final parable in Matthew. the judgment of the sheep and the goats. Someday, Jesus says, he will ascend his throne and judge all nations, distinguishing between sheep and goats. Jesus usually uses the word for nations here to refer to Gentiles. Jesus has said much about the judgment of his own people. In his very last parable, he focuses on the Gentiles. At this future judgment, Jesus will distinguish between distorted forms of human goodness and the real thing by separating the sheep from the goats. In the recurring biblical image of sheep, usually the sheep are the covenant people. Before he sent his disciples off to reach out to their fellow Jews, Jesus told them to go to the lost sheep of Israel. The Gentile sheep in this parable hint that Jesus believes some Gentiles will be included in the covenant people. This is a remarkably inclusive approach for a Jewish teacher to take to Gentiles, those foreskin-toting, bacon-eating polytheists. Jesus distinguishes between sheep and goats by disclosing the true character of distorted human goodness and contrasting it with the real thing. When the sheep encountered Jesus when he was hungry or thirsty or in prison, they acted mercifully. The goats didn't. This again recalls Jesus' earlier speech to his 12 disciples before their outreach to their fellow Jews. He said God would someday judge those they encounter based on how they treat their disciples. Anyone who treats them mercifully will be rewarded, and if not, they'll be punished. Jesus is now extending that earlier promise to include the more dangerous work of reaching out to Gentiles. Earlier, Jesus described his followers as thirsty. In this parable, he adds to that list: hungry, sick, in prison. These are the conditions that Jesus' Jewish followers will suffer when they first reach out to Gentiles. When Jesus tells the sheep and the goats that they encountered him, neither know what he's talking about. Their failure to recognize Jesus does not determine whether they're sheep or they're goats. We return again to Jesus' earlier speech, when he told his disciples that the Jews they meet would be judged according to two criteria. First, whether they acted mercifully toward them, and second, whether they recognized them as prophets. God will hold the covenant people accountable for whether they recognize that God was at work in Jesus' followers. Yet, in our parable, the only criterion applied to the Gentiles is whether they treated Jesus' representatives mercifully. They aren't expected to recognize Jesus in his followers because they have no grounds for doing so. They know nothing of the Jewish law or the covenant. Another aspect of Jesus' account of divine judgment, then, is that God treats different cases differently. But not entirely differently. God won't expect the Gentiles to recognize Jesus' disciples as prophets, but God will still hold the Gentiles accountable for how they treat Jesus' first followers. There seems to be a natural law by which all human beings can be judged. Recall that Jesus summarized the Jewish law with a pair of commandments. Love God with your whole self, and love your neighbor as yourself. So when it comes to those Gentile sheep, perhaps the second commandment alone is the criterion by which they are judged. Or maybe not. Perhaps when Gentiles love their Jewish neighbors as themselves, they are implicitly loving God too. Back to the goats, who are thrown into the fire, another image of hell. Jesus twice uses a Greek adjective here that is most frequently translated into English as eternal. I'm suspicious of this translation. At its most general, aeonion describes an indefinite period of time. Sometimes it's an indefinite period that will come to an eventual end. Other times, it's an indefinite period that is unending. Based on the Greek alone, either meaning is possible. Here's one reason that I'm suspicious that eternal is the right translation. Jesus only uses this adjective 3 times to describe hell, and only when speaking privately to his disciples. If hell is a place of unending torment, wouldn't Jesus mention that more than 3 times, and not just to his small inner circle? It seems especially strange that he wouldn't stress that hell is eternal to the scribes and the Pharisees, against whom he unleashes his fiercest rhetoric. So we should try another translation. Instead of describing the punishment of the goats as eternal fire, we'll try the fire of the age. In his earlier parable, Jesus said the harvest was an image of the end of the age. The repetition you hear in those 2 English phrases is there in the Greek. Fire of the age includes the adjective, and end of the age includes the noun. These 2 words share the same root. Jesus' talk of the harvest seems to have stuck with his disciples, as much later they ask him to say more about the end of the age. He ends his lengthy response to their question with our parable. In other words, Jesus is answering their question about the end of the age, at least in part, with the parable of the sheep and the goats. Jesus isn't describing hell as eternal. Instead, he's filling out for his disciples what the end of the age will involve, just as they asked him to do. He recalls the harvest so his disciples compare the Gentile goats to the Jewish weeds. One kind of weed are those who contort the gift of the Jewish law, and so too the goats are those who refuse the natural law. Jesus is underlining for his disciples the justice of God's judgment. God's judgment treats different cases differently, but not entirely differently. This is confirmed by the reward of the sheep who will inherit the kingdom prepared for them since the foundations of the universe were laid. These Gentile sheep will be declared as citizens of the kingdom of heaven, participants in God's ongoing work of uniting heaven and earth. The sheep will receive the life of the age. This is our crucial adjective again, which recalls Jesus' description of the harvest. The Gentile sheep are similar to the Jewish wheat. Jesus underlines that some Gentiles will be rewarded the same way as Jesus' closest Jewish followers will be, though the Gentiles will be judged on somewhat different terms. Jesus here underlines the generosity of God's judgment, as some Gentiles will be welcomed in. So Jesus is inviting his followers to another act of imagination, to see the Gentiles they will encounter as possible fellow sharers in God's kingdom on earth. With Jesus' parables, we have uncovered the essential aspects of divine judgment. God distinguishes between a distorted form of human goodness and the real thing, and does so by disclosing the true character of each. Jesus views divine judgment as an act of communication, a making public of what might otherwise have been obscured. In this, Jesus stands within the long line of Hebrew prophets who announced God's judgment against the perversion of the gifts of the law and religious authority in order to renew the covenant people. Divine judgment includes punishment, but that punishment is never an end in itself. It is always intended for the sake of reform and renewal. Jesus also claims that God's judgment is just, as God will judge Jews differently than Gentiles, though still consistently. Crucially, for the final part of this lecture, I have also argued that Jesus never describes hell as eternal. Jesus' hell is not a place people go forever after they die. The divine judgment of hell, also known as the end of the age, is an impending historical catastrophe which marks a transition from one age to the next. So on to part 3, which is also the shortest of the 3 parts. Part 3, what the heck is hell? Gehenna is the Greek translation of the Hebrew phrase Valley of Hinnom, a valley that surrounds Jerusalem, familiar to Jesus' listeners. The biblical prophet Jeremiah was the first to associate that valley with divine judgment. In the 7th century BCE, he warned the citizens of Jerusalem that God was outraged by their acts of unfaithfulness and injustice, especially their child sacrifices, done in the Valley of Hinnom. Jeremiah predicted that if they didn't change, the Babylonian Empire would invade Jerusalem, killing many and destroying the temple. And the violence would be so swift and overwhelming that there wouldn't be time to bury the dead, so corpses would end up piled in the Valley of Hinnom. Those who sacrificed their children in that valley would themselves end up unburied within it. In 586, 587 BCE, all of the above occurred. Now, here's an important biblical bit of trivia for us. Matthew has by far the most references to hell of any of the Gospels, and by far the most references to Jeremiah. Matthew presents Jesus as a second Jeremiah, and I will argue Jesus' hell is a repetition of Jeremiah's hell, a divine judgment within history, a this worldly event. We'll consider just a handful of the many allusions to Jeremiah in Matthew. Jeremiah announced God's coming judgment by going right to the temple. When Jesus first enters Jerusalem, he does the same. Then he quotes Jeremiah's description of the temple as a den of robbers. Jesus revives Jeremiah's criticism of how the temple authorities misuse the Jewish law and abuse their religious authority for economic gain. Jesus also turns over the tables of the market stands and drives out the sellers, and then invites in the blind and the sick and heals them. Later, Jesus will state what he repeatedly implies, that he foresees the imminent destruction of the temple. And with his demonstration in the temple, he anticipates that and embodies in himself the divine judgment which Jeremiah described. Matthew makes our second allusion to Jeremiah. After Judas sees Jesus arrested, he regrets what he did and returns the money he was paid to betray Jesus. The temple authorities take his money, then send him away. Because of a law from Deuteronomy, they can't put Judas's money into the temple account. They decide to use it to buy a graveyard for foreigners, reflecting the long-standing Jewish care for refugees. So notice on the one hand their rigorous adherence to the law, yet they didn't show any concern for Judas. They failed to act mercifully. And after he leaves them, Judas takes his life. Matthew says this fulfills Jeremiah. He's making us do some detective work. There are 3 clear allusions to Jeremiah here. First, Matthew describes the temple authorities using an identical phrase as Jeremiah. Second, Judas says he regrets shedding innocent blood, using an identical phrase as Jeremiah. And third, Matthew describes the renaming of a field, as does Jeremiah. This cluster of allusions all come from Jeremiah chapter 19. There are 2 chapters in Jeremiah in which the prophet predicts a coming divine judgment centered on the Valley of Hinnom, chapter 7 and chapter 19. In his demonstration in the temple, Jesus quotes from chapter 7. Matthew says the temple authorities fulfill chapter 19. One more detail. The most likely location for the field the priests buy is a valley just outside Jerusalem, the Valley of Hinnom. The temple authorities use Judas's money to buy real estate in hell. Matthew subtly identifies Jesus' hell as a repeat of Jeremiah's hell. The final allusion to Jeremiah we'll consider is in Jesus' final rant against the scribes and the Pharisees. It includes at least 4 allusions to Jeremiah. We'll consider just one. Jesus' speech is structured around 8 woes. And that's woe as in woe is me, not woe dude. He warns them of hell. I thought we needed a joke at this late point in the evening. He warns them of hell with the 8th woe, which coincides with Jesus' 7th and final reference to Gehenna. Beginning with the 7 days of creation, a 7-member series represents a complete cycle, with the 7th member as its culmination. Here we have the completion of 2 cycles. The 8th and final woe in Jesus' speech coincides with the 7th and final Gehenna, 7th and final Gehenna in Matthew. Jesus' denouncement of the Pharisees is his culmination of the announcement of divine judgment against the distortion of the law. Several lines after he warns of hell, Jesus says, I'm quoting, "Your house is left to you desolate." He uses the exact same verb that Jeremiah does to describe how God's presence leaves the temple in response to its corruption. This implies that God will no longer protect the temple. As Jesus has it, God has repeatedly attempted to recall the religious authorities back to the fullness of the covenant, including through Jesus himself, but they have stubbornly resisted. This speech serves as the culmination of Jesus' announcement of divine judgment, because he doesn't just warn them of hell, as he has already done many times before. He also says exactly what hell will be. Jesus' hell is what will happen after God no longer protects the temple. Jesus' hell is a repetition of Jeremiah's hell. Jeremiah's hell arrived with the invasion of the Babylonian Empire. Several decades after Jesus' death, in response to a violent rebellion, the Roman Empire began a war with the Jews. In 70 CE, the Roman Empire invaded Jerusalem and destroyed the Second Temple. As the 1st century Roman historian Josephus records it, the violence was so swift and overwhelming that there wasn't time to bury the dead. So the corpses were piled up high in the Valley of Hinnom, also known as Gehenna, also known as hell. It is a matter of historical record then, right down to the latter horrifying detail, that Jeremiah's hell repeated itself in the 1st century. And if Jesus' hell is a repeat of Jeremiah's hell, then it occurred in the 1st century. Jesus' hell wasn't only historical. Jesus' hell is history. Jesus warned that hell would come when God's presence abandons the temple in response to its corruption. This reflects a last aspect of divine judgment, which has a long biblical precedent. God's judgment sometimes works by allowing human beings to be confronted by the full consequences of their actions. Jeremiah was not the only prophet to see this judgment taking place by the invasion of a foreign empire. In the 8th century BCE, the prophets Amos and Isaiah both warned of God's coming judgment through the invasions of the Assyrian and Babylonian empires. As we know, Jeremiah made his own similar predictions a couple centuries later. Yet according to the prophets, it's not that God is behind these violent, invasive empires. God isn't responsible for imperial vice and evil. Instead, God makes use of it to serve some good. When the prophets warn that God is going to use these empires as means of judgment, that does not mean God condones these empires. Instead, the biblical prophets, including Jesus, believed that God is at work in history, cunningly ensuring that good comes out of evil. God's judgment always involves both a no and a yes, a public rejection of a distorted form of goodness, and the illumination of an alternative to it. Take Matthew's account of the crucifixion. As Matthew tells it, the religious authorities conspired to have Jesus killed, the political authorities went along, and by the time he was hanging on a cross, all 12 of his disciples had abandoned him. It was only a group of women who stayed with him, following him first from Galilee to Jerusalem, a journey of about 100 miles, and then they remained with him as he was crucified. Only 2 of these women's names are recorded, so seemingly insignificant were they. Surely any reasonable person faced with these details would predict that Jesus' fledgling movement would not make much of a mark. It reminds me of my favorite parable. Jesus says that the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which starts out so small it's imperceptible. And because of its unpredictable growth and rather unlovely appearance, it's widely regarded as a weed. Yet, from its insignificant beginnings, mustard seeds can become trees with large, luxurious branches, which make a perfect shelter for birds. Thank you.